maybe time has caught up with Snyder's vision for superheroes, and just living in the worst possible reality has made his vision suddenly seem light and fluffy by comparison. Doesn't look so dark now, does it? So after that shockingly cynical opening gag, even for me, I wanted to sort of talk through my thoughts on the concept, not really the possibility, I'll get to that, but the concept of possibly continuing on with Zack Snyder's vision for DC films, for the DCEU, which I will henceforth be referring to as the Snyderverse. So, as kind of been predicted, with the premiere of Zack Snyder's Justice League, there has been some call, so far at least not as loud as there was for the Snyder Cut of Justice League, but there has been some call and some push, or at least some inquiry as to, hey, this seemed to be okay and went down, well, definitely better than the version you released to theaters. Could we maybe have the films that this was supposed to lead into? And I kind of want to talk through that as an idea from an artistic perspective, from a brand management perspective. But before I dive down this rabbit hole, this is a thought exercise. I do not believe that we are going to see Warner Brothers finance the return of the Snyderverse. And I'm almost certain about that. I have to stick an almost on there because I was fairly certain we were never going to get the Snyder Cut. But even taking that into account, I do not think we're ever going to see this happen. And I'll get into some of the reasons towards the end, but here's the big one. The Snyder Cut of Justice League was actually a fairly low financial commitment for Warner Brothers to make because most of it was already shot. They had to fund reshoots and a bunch of redos and expansions of effects work, and that was not exactly cheap, about the tune of $70 million. But you add that to the cost of what they sank into Justice League the first time around, and they basically got a $400 million movie for $70 million to release on their platform that they're trying desperately to big up as much as possible right now. It made a lot of sense from a lot of perspectives. Now, trying to take any of the things that Zack Snyder's film was meant to set up that seem to either have been scrapped, have since gone in a different direction, or are in some kind of limbo, things like the Flash movie, the Cyborg movie, any kind of direct continuation of Justice League, that means paying for the entire cost of that new movie up front. And given that Warner Brothers already kind of had to eat it on Justice League, definitely, and Batman v Superman, while not a flop, underperformed for what they had projected and thought it was going to make. I have a hard time believing that they'd throw that much more money at it. $70 million throwing at the Snyder Cut, while not a drop in the bucket, all things considered, looking at it now and getting a proper perspective of what it was that everything was going on, and knowing that this was part of the intended push to really make HBO Max more of a presence as a streaming service, and knowing how much of a priority that is for AT&T now that they own Warner Brothers, yeah, that made a lot of sense. But taking it as a given that I do not believe anything that I'm about to talk about will actually ever happen, let's talk about the artistic merit and the sort of potential fallout consequences. Would it be worth it? Ideas of this. So the first thing to bring up is, well, what would immediately follow on from this? Because a couple of the things have in fact happened, such as Aquaman, such as Wonder Woman, which has had its first sequel. That has already happened, and those franchises have already started to distance themselves, not necessarily from Snyder's continuity blatantly, but definitely distance themselves from his tone and mood, and kind of struck out and did their own things. And in the case of Aquaman, there are legitimately continuity issues between that and Zack Snyder's Justice League. So, there's there's that, and then there's the stuff that just hasn't happened yet. There's the Flash movie that keeps changing directors every other year and never seems to move forward, and I'm kind of going to be surprised if that ever happens. I think if I were to guess, I have no insider knowledge. I should make that clear. I don't have a source. So, don't think that I know what's really going on. But if I were to guess, I would say they probably keep retooling what it is that the Flash movie is intended to be. Because originally, at its earliest conceptions, it would have just been something to follow on from Justice League. But then once they realized that Batman v Superman didn't go down as well as they wanted, and Justice League started to become what it became in terms of the theatrical version, they started talking up Flashpoint as if they were going to use that to serve as a kind of way to reboot the universe, except that then got stalled, and then the Aquaman and Wonder Woman movies just moved forward without really acknowledging Justice League much at all and seemed to be fine, which made the idea of a reboot and retooling Flashpoint style story may not even be necessary anymore because the other franchises are chugging along just fine. So then what do you even do at this point? Now, they seem to still be holding on to that, but that keeps going back and forth. The idea of a Cyborg movie seemed to have been scrapped almost immediately following the release of Justice League. And since I mentioned Cyborg, that kind of brings up another thing which factors in on Snyder as well. Will Snyder and some of the people who are kind of core to what it looked like he was building even be willing to come back? I mean, one could say, well, sure, Snyder would, except that, look, he came back to do Justice League because Warner Brothers were the only people he could work with if he was ever going to get a chance to finish that. It was their movie. So he had to come back and work with Warner Brothers, but that relationship seems really splintered after the events of the Justice League filming. And I don't want to delve too much into sort of trying to figure that out because there are conflicting reports about how much did Snyder's leaving to mourn the loss of his daughter, how much of that was just an excuse that Warner Brothers really were happy to have to boot him, and we don't really know for certain. But there does seem to have been a splintering of that relationship because they were already moving forward the DCEU as much as possible without Snyder. And Snyder, for the first time in a long time, made a film without them because he's got the Army of the Dead, I think is the one, the zombie film that's coming out on Netflix. He's been at Warner Brothers for a while. So for him to leave them to do a movie somewhere else, that doesn't bode too well with the idea that he's willing to come back and work with them again after what's gone on with Justice League mainly. And even if he was willing, I think he has to know by now that even with the Snyder Cut released and better received, they're still not going to grant him that level of control on a theatrically released film. The only reason they did for Snyder Cut is because, well, that's what they bought. They were paying for and selling the Snyder Cut. If they didn't give him full control, then there was no point in doing any of it. But what Snyder does is expensive. His approach is expensive. Though these movies are expensive anyways. And to sink a lot of money in that when, at least as far as the kind of numbers and returns and critical reception that Warner Brothers wanted, they've already seen it fail, let's say 2.5 times. The very middling response on Man of Steel, the very hotly contested response to Batman v Superman, and then give him a half credit for the original theatrical release of Justice League. I can't imagine that they would spring for it. It would be an odd choice. The other thing is, I mentioned Zack Snyder, and maybe he could be convinced to come back. I think the bigger issue would be Ray Fisher, who played Cyborg, because he obviously clashed at this point very publicly with not only Joss Whedon, who seems to be the only one who's really meting out a lot of consequences from that, and plus, other things that people have come forward to talk about. But Fisher has said flat out, he will not come back and work for Warner Brothers as long as Walter Hamada is still there. Now, Walter Hamada is a studio head, kind of, I don't think he's really equivalent to Kevin Feige, but he's one of the big people at the high-end executive studio level who was in charge of the DCEU. And Ray Fisher, I would say not wrongly, holds Hamada responsible for the fact that Whedon was allowed to behave and treat Fisher on set the way that he did. He saw a Walter Hamada as enabling and empowering the behavior that he was speaking, that he later came forward and spoke out against. And there's no indication that Warner Brothers is going to get rid of Walter Hamada. And I don't think they would, just to bring back who is, up to this point, a supporting player in an alternate cut of a movie where he looks much better, and a supporting actor in a tanked version earlier of that movie. And I definitely don't see them giving him his own film. And then the question becomes, would Snyder be willing to work under circumstances where he wouldn't get Ray Fisher, who obviously he still wanted to work with? In the flash forward thing in Zack Snyder's Justice League, he's one of the superheroes still alive. So clearly the intention was to keep doing more things with him. So that becomes another complication. Even if you get Snyder back and give him the control, are you going to be willing to fire one of your major executives for the sake of bringing back an actor that Snyder clearly wanted to work with? I don't see that happening. And I do honestly think that Ray Fisher will put his foot down and will hold to that line, because at this point, for the kind of, like, he has taken on Goliath of this. He seemed to be perfectly willing. He seemed to have accepted publicly that he was tanking his career, speaking out against Joss Whedon and Walter Hamada, amongst others. So if he was already willing to accept that as the possible outcome of speaking out when he did it in the first place, I can't imagine he's going to bend at a later point. I mean, it's not impossible, but he doesn't strike me like he's going to. So there's a whole bunch of, beyond just the cost of it, of just logistical people management of trying to get any of this made. And then there's the question of, what about the franchises that have continued forward without Snyder's influence? Like Aquaman, which is going to be getting its sequel, which is not uncontroversial, but that's related to Amber Heard. I've talked about that before. So, but that's moving forward in its own direction and doing its own thing, as is Wonder Woman at this point, though with the reception of Wonder Woman 1984 being mixed at best. That might be a little more uncertain now, but the people at the top seem content to let these start to become their own things. And that, I think, is the biggest issue. When Snyder was building this in the first place, it was on the presumption that he would be shaping this entire thing, which was a gamble that ultimately didn't pay off. And it is a gamble worth comparing to what Marvel does, because it's worth remembering that Marvel has had underperforming films, and in fact has had some very early in its life cycle. Nobody really talks about the Incredible Hulk movie with Edward Norton anymore. And it wasn't a flop, but it didn't do great. There have been other things, Thor: The Dark World, that have hiccuped along the way, but it's never caused the entire thing to collapse, because Marvel has never been dependent on a singular vision for the entire thing. They have for certain individual franchises, see James Gunn and Guardians of the Galaxy, but not for the entire apparatus, which is why, like, some people have asked in regards to Joss Whedon, since I've had to bring him up anyways, why are we talking about whether or not it's still okay to consume things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Firefly, Dollhouse, Angel, but not so much talking about the MCU? Because, he directed the first two Avengers films, and he did, but he wasn't the sole voice or even the primary driving force behind the franchise. Like, maybe for a couple of movies he was, but then he burned out and he left, and Marvel seemed to have learned right then, like, okay, We have Kevin Feige to oversee and keep this. We don't need the director of a specific franchise to be setting the tone for everything, which makes everything much more self-contained and much less likely to fall apart just because of one franchise tanking or one director's vision bottoming out. Whereas DC really put all their eggs in the Zack Snyder basket at first, which was why things were such a jumbled mess initially. And you can even look at something like Suicide Squad, which Snyder did not direct, but very much seemed to have been made with the deliberate intent to fit into the darker, grittier, desaturated, violent world that Snyder had created. Whereas stuff that's gone on since then, like definitely something like Shazam, almost feels like it is refuting a lot of that atmosphere. And that's the kind of stuff that has come about after Snyder has been away and not touching any of this stuff. So the question becomes, if you were to let him come back and start rebuilding the Snyderverse, do you forcibly wrench all the other franchises that have been starting to go out in their own directions back into line with what he would have had them be if he had still been at the helm of this whole thing from a creative standpoint? Or do you just not allow him to have access to the things that have gone off and done their own thing? Like, you don't let him mess with Wonder Woman, you don't let him mess with Aquaman, you don't let him touch Shazam, and you're like, okay, look, you can have Superman, you can have Batman, you can have Flash, have Cyborg, but leave the rest of these alone. Well, but then are you really reinstating the Snyderverse? Because you'd be imposing a whole bunch of restrictions that wouldn't be there in the first place. Something's got to give. And it also made me think about my own reaction to Zack Snyder's Justice League, because I liked it quite a bit more than I would have thought. Actually, possibly more than any other movie he's made sans 300. But I realized afterwards, and actually after even I shot my review, so I didn't even mention this there, though you can still check that out. Part of why I took to this as well as I did was because I knew it wasn't setting the tone for what was going to come. Part of what was so soul-crushing for me about a movie like Batman v Superman, aside from its own issues, which I think it has plenty, but it wasn't what I wanted to keep seeing. Whereas Zack Snyder's Justice League, I was able to treat as, this is not something that I'm going to watch and then know every other DC movie will be like this. This is something I'm going to watch as an alternate version, as an out of continuity take. And I can be way more accepting of things that I don't necessarily agree with or think are good for these characters or this world or the genre as a whole, if I know that that film is not going to be the template on which a bunch of future stuff is being built. Had the Zack Snyder version of Justice League been released to theaters, and I mentioned in that review, it was never going to be, not in the state we saw it. 4 hours, are you kidding me? No, that was never going to happen. But just for a second, let's say that it was. I would not have liked it nearly as much as I did watching it on HBO Max, if only for the fact that I would have gone, oh God, everything in the DCEU is going to be like this. And not because it's bad, but because it's not what I want to be the standard. That's not what I want the baseline of these movies to be. Speaking for myself. So that then begs the question, what if the Snyderverse was just an HBO Max thing? What if it was kind of its own continuity, and you're not releasing it to theaters where it's going to confuse, your average moviegoers who are wondering, well, we have Robert Pattinson in The Batman and we've got Ben Affleck saying that he's saying to the Joker,
make no mistake, I will kill you.
Yeah, is this the same guy? What is going on? If you were to restrict it to the premium service, Would that make more sense? Yes, but then we bump into the realistic expense issue again, which is, again, looking at Zack Snyder's Justice League, they basically got a $400 million movie for $70 million. So to spend that kind of money, like I mentioned at the front end, I don't think they would think it'd be worth it in a theatrical release to spend the kind of money that would allow Snyder from the ground up to start continuing his ideas. They're definitely not going to spend that on just the streaming service. Because as much as the streaming service is very important right now, you still have to have the books balance. And a lot of what I'm saying about what will or won't happen, the thing is, there's one major X factor in all of this that makes it harder to predict than it should be, which is AT&T. Because AT&T buying Warner Brothers changes the priorities. Because Warner Brothers could have been looking at things from a more long-term sustained viability perspective. But the way corporate consolidation works, and especially for something as big as AT&T buying Warner Brothers, and for them, the DC stuff is just a sliver of that. They care about what you add to the portfolio right now. They care about sustainability on the grand scale of their entire company. They don't really care if a specific division is sustainable long term. If it's not, they'll just cut it. So knowing that, or at least knowing that's a possibility, and not knowing exactly where AT&T has placed its priorities are definitely not with the publishing arm of DC, which they gutted. Did a video on that back when that happened. So it really does become more difficult because I can make what I think are reasonably decent guesses at what these studios would do if they did not have a bigger entity breathing down their neck and scouring their books. But they do. And that makes things a little bit harder depending on what the priorities of the bigger company are. But pulling things back to the main sort of franchise management reason why I don't think it's a good idea, beyond just the viability, but I don't think it's ultimately a good idea to try and bring back the Snyderverse. And this is not a judgment on what the quality of it would have been, although, full disclosure, I probably wouldn't enjoy it that much, but I'm trying not to let that cloud my judgment. Is that too much has changed since Snyder left Justice League. Warner Brothers had its period of scrambling, trying to figure out what it was going to do. And the closest thing that it's got to figuring out what to do was to just treat each of these things separately. Because like I said, when they put all their eggs in the Snyder basket, the whole thing felt like it was falling apart. But when they got Wonder Woman established as its own thing, and Shazam was pretty much a self-contained thing, and Aquaman was pretty much a self-contained thing, and everyone's super excited for the Suicide Squad, which does not fit the tone and the vibe of the Zack Snyder version of these characters in this world. And you had Birds of Prey, and Warner Brothers does seem to really be happy to continue to bank and throw Harley Quinn at the wall in as many projects as possible and just hope that it sticks. And she's honestly been better received as light and funny and not angsty. I don't think there's a place to reinsert Snyder at the head of all this without basically throwing all the rest of that out. And I don't think that would be worth it. Not from a business standpoint, not really from an artistic standpoint. Here's what I would be curious to see, and what I would kind of like to see if Snyder is willing. I would happily read a graphic novel of whatever his follow-up to Justice League was going to be. I would be more than happy to get a sense of what he wanted to do. Because, like I said, his version of Justice League went down much better for me than I expected it to. Even with, the caveats that I said, that I got to treat it like an Elseworlds. And I am curious what else he was going to do. But I don't expect to ever be able to see it on film. And I'm not sure it would be good for the franchise as a whole for it to happen. Because Marvel has certainly shown you can get away with interconnecting these things and having a sprawling continuity. But DC's own success with its individual franchises in the wake of Batman v Superman and Justice League has also shown that they can have success treating these as their own thing and not worrying about the continuity. Because Aquaman made over $1 billion, and there are complaints to be had about that film, but they weren't along the lines of, why weren't there more nods to the main continuity? It didn't need them. Nor did Wonder Woman. Nor did Shazam. And we're getting good products just by not worrying about it. And that could be enough to distinguish it more from Marvel. Hey, is that continuity-laden mess where if you missed the last few films, you feel like you don't know what the heck is going on too much? Oh, sorry to hear that. Here's a Suicide Squad movie where you don't really need to have seen all the previous stuff. It stands on its own. Have fun. That could be the way in which DC is the alternative to Marvel, as opposed to being darker and grittier and having Batman say he's gonna f***ing kill the Joker. Because I'm not sure how artistically, financially, long-term viable that is. Ultimately, the main thing that sells reliably is a quality product well made. Not always selling as well as it should, unfortunately, but you're going to be on much better standing if you just make good stuff. And with his version of Justice League, I do think Snyder did actually make a pretty good thing. But people have also been making good stuff in the DCEU completely absent his influence. I think that might be the best way to move forward. So those are my rambling thoughts on the concept of bringing back the Snyderverse. What do you think about all this? Were you even able to follow my train of thought? I don't know. I don't know if I can. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I have a Patreon. Hopefully there'll be a link up there. If not, it's down in the description because YouTube is broken and doesn't pay my bills. Patreon pays my bills. And I do like to eat. But don't worry too much about it if you're not able to. There are perks as well for YouTube memberships. That helps me too. But even if you can't do that, the likes, the shares, the subscribes, those help me out also. But you don't even have to worry about that. Because at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.